So watching Know Your Right, this is Asake Online. My name is Brighton. Over the past few weeks, I've been talking to lawyers, talking to students, as well as politicians on the issue of the constitutional amendments in Zimbabwe. But one voice that has been missing in this conversation has been that of Senator David Coltart. So this morning, joining us is Senator David Coltart to discuss more about the constitutional amendments in Zimbabwe. Senator, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Brighton.
Right, Senator, let's look at the issue of the withdrawal of MDC A Mps in Parliament. What are the legal implications of the withdrawal of the MPs in Parliament?
It's a very serious breach of Section 129(1)(k) of the Constitution, which allows, of course, parliamentarians to be withdrawn where the party says that those people no longer belong to the party which they stood under when they were elected. And if you look at the parliamentary website, never mind anything else, the parliamentary website says that there are three political parties in Parliament: ZANU-PF, the MDC A and the MDC T. And here you have people who claim to be members of the MDC T, who were in fact elected on an MDC A ticket, now writing to the Speaker to say that MDC A Mps no longer belong to MDC T. You couldn't read this in Alice in Wonderland. And yet the Speaker, without making an inquiry, acts in this quasi-judicial function to say that these MDC A Mps should be withdrawn. It's absurd, it is fundamentally illegal, and it is a very serious breach of the Constitution, not just in terms of law, but its spirit. Here we have an election in July 2018. People are clearly vote for people of their choice. And then you get another party they didn't vote for having the right to decide who will represent them in Parliament. It's a farce.
But let's break down the Supreme Court ruling. Let's break it down, make people understand the contents of the Supreme Court ruling.
Well, the Supreme Court ruling is very clear in that it refers to the MDC T. At page 32 of the judgment, Advocate Maduku says very clearly, and it's not disputed by the judge, that there is a dispute within the MDC T, that there are two factions within the MDC T. So the judgment is there. We accept the judgment. We criticize the reasoning used by the court, as is our right in arriving at the judgment, but ultimately it compels Madam Ncube, who is the acting president or president of the MDC-T, to hold an extraordinary Congress within 3 months. And that is fine. She must go and hold that extraordinary Congress. We will not interfere with it. But nowhere in the judgment is there any mention of the MDC A, the MDC Alliance, which Parliament, the Minister of Justice, the Ministry of Finance, the Herald, everyone accepts is a distinct, a different political party.
So however, withdrawal of MDC A from Parliament, the MPs withdrawal from Parliament, how will that affect the work of the Parliament?
Well, of course, it's designed to cut the head off of the MDC-A in Parliament. They've deliberately gone for our four key members of Parliament. The Chief Whip, the Leader of the House in the lower house, the Leader of the Senate, and the Secretary General, Charlton Wende. So it's designed to separate our broader body of MPs from its leadership within Parliament. And there's no doubt that the intention is to try and pick off people so that eventually they intimidate more and more of our MPs and ultimately have what is effectively a second coup. We had a coup in November 2017, and now we have a second bloodless coup to effectively transform Parliament into a one-party Parliament.
Mm-hmm. But I'm still talking about the issue of MPs, but there's a tweet by you, Senator, that's been doing around social media about members of the MDCA partaking in an election as MDCA, but however going back to their own parties after the election. How do you read to that?
So we need to look at the factual chronology of this. And we actually need to go back as far as 2005, when the original MDC split. You will recall in October 2005 it split, and Morgan Tsvangirai split from Gibson Sibanda. And that saw the emergence of two separate MDC parties. In the 2008 election, when I was elected senator for Khumalo, I was elected on behalf of the MDC without any suffix or prefix to it. There was another party at that stage, a party called the MDC T, and it won that election in 2008. When the global political agreement was agreed to at the end of 2008, it was signed by three separate political parties, ZANU-PF, the MDC-T, and the MDC. And that's what formed the Government of National Unity. In the 2013 election, there were three political parties, ZANU-PF, MDC-T, and the MDC. Now, in the run-up to the 2018 election, we had this dispute within the MDC-T. Now, bear in mind, I have personally never been a member of the MDC-T. I've always been a member of the MDC without any suffix or prefixes. So I wasn't party to those disputes. But in the run-up to the election, some 7 political parties decided to form a coalition. And that coalition was called the MDC Alliance. And we fought that election as a coalition of political parties. It had one presidential candidate, and the agreement itself said that after the election, if the different political parties won seats, they would have their own chief whips for their respective parties. But the agreement itself says that after the election, the agreement would be reviewed, and it was reviewed after the election. All parties were asked whether they would like to transform this coalition into a single political party. And 3 of the political parties did that. Some, like Transform Zimbabwe, decided not to. But my own party, the MDC, resolved, we went to our National Council, and we resolved that we would dissolve the MDC and form and come into this new political party called the MDC Alliance. And that process was consummated, finalized with the Congress which occurred in Gweru in May last year, where one single political party comprising these different elements to it was formed and elected one president, 3 vice presidents, a Treasurer General, a Secretary General. And certainly from that moment, but it actually occurred before that, because the agreement to dissolve these different political entities occurred before May 2019. But as I say, it was consummated and finalized with the Congress in Gweru in May 2019. And from that time on, you had a very clear party that was not a coalition, but was a singular political party with one chief whip in Parliament. And in fact, we only had one chief whip in Parliament from immediately after the elections. We never did have several chief whips, mainly because the vast majority of MPs, right from the very beginning, understood that the coalition would transform into a single political party. And that is now all water under the bridge. Parliament itself accepted that the MDC Alliance was a political party. To this day, that is reflected in the parliamentary website. The Ministry of Justice, likewise, and the Ministry of Finance accepted that it was a political party. The calculation of the percentage that we are due in terms of the Political Parties Finance Act wasn't based on how many MDC members form part of this allowance and how many were PDP or MDC. It was viewed as one political party, and that is how we received payment in several tranches last year. The Herald itself, even Mr. Mnangagwa accepted that it was a political party, and the Supreme Court itself, in its judgment in the Chamisa and Mnangagwa matter, accepted that the MDC Alliance was a political party. So it's simply farcical now to say that it is anything but. And even Mr. Komichi, in a recent interview, demonstrated the farce when he was questioned. So he was asked the question at the beginning of the interview, so why have you dismissed Messrs. Wendy and others from Parliament? Actually, I've got the sequence wrong. He said, is the MDC Alliance a political party? And he said, no, it's not a political party. It's a coalition. And then he was asked the question, so why did you fire Messrs. Wendy and company? Oh, because they belonged to another political party. Which political party was it? The MDC Alliance. So even in a short interview, one sees the contradictions in their argument.
After the by-election, which will be called by Emerson Mnangagwa for these MPs who are called in Parliament, will the by-election be democratic?
Well, we will have to wait and see. Given the past record in Zimbabwe, elections have been anything but lawful, free and fair. The Zimbabwe Electoral Commission itself is, in my view, a partisan organization. And for so long as the most important institution responsible for running elections is partisan, one cannot have lawful, free and fair elections.
Now let's look at the recent happenings in Zimbabwe, the abductions. As I said, we saw the MDC youths marching and demonstrating in Harare, and they were arrested. And the police accepted that they arrested them, then later denied them. What's your take on that? You said in your tweet this morning that you've been a lawyer since 1983. People have been abducted, tortured, and beaten by the police, but they have never seen justice for the state agencies. What's your reaction to that?
Well, the events of this week are particularly worrying because it marks a further deterioration in the human rights situation in this country. If we look at the sequence of events since Wednesday, what is clear is that at about midday on Wednesday, these 3 young women were arrested by the police. The Assistant Commissioner responsible for publicity, the spokesman of the police, Paul Inyati, clearly gave a statement to the Herald, which was published in the Herald on Thursday morning, confirming that these 3 women had been arrested and were in custody. Then on Thursday lunchtime, there was a tweet made by the official police handle stating, and I quote, that they were not in police custody, without stating what had happened to them, into whose custody they had been released. And then we finally find that at midnight on Thursday, these 3 women are discovered out in the bush, far from Harare, severely tortured. And it is one of the most brazen acts that I've seen in the 37 years of practicing. In the past, state agents have abducted people, and there's always been a denial. For example, if we think of Peter Magombe's abduction last year, we still don't know exactly who did it. And there was a strenuous attempt made by the government to deny that they were responsible for him. And no clear evidence that he was ever taken into, for example, police custody. But here we have clear evidence and admission by the spokesman of the police that they were arrested were in police custody and then were released. 3 young women, not even men, were released into the charge of men, and they have been severely tortured. It is profoundly shocking. It shows that those responsible do not care how this plays out in the international community.
Senator Coltart, there's a tweet that came this morning from Nick Mangwana, a government official, saying that these things are choreographed. There's a system, you can't throw a curveball to the system, and you can't fool people by playing the same scene many times over and over. How do you read those statements coming from the government official?
Well, going back to 1983, I've been representing, long before I got into politics myself, I've represented political parties, including ZAPU and the Forum Party. I was instructed by Joshua Nkomo to represent ZAPU in the 1980s. And we know that this is the tactic which has been used by ZANU-PF for almost 4 decades. People like Sidney Malunga were arrested and severely tortured. When I first took instructions from Sidney Malunga in 1985, when I went to prison, he literally hobbled across the prison courtyard to me because he had torture administered to the soles of his feet. And that has been their consistent practice ever since then. And it comes right up to last year. We have the evidence of a doctor, Peter Magombe, the president of the Junior Hospital Doctors Association, a professional man who was abducted and injected with God only knows what substance, severely tortured and dumped. He is very clear in all the evidence that he has given that he was not abducted by forces other than those who bear allegiance to Mr. Mnangagwa. And his fellow professional medical peers have confirmed that he was tortured. Is someone going to inflict that on themselves? Of course not. Here we have a continuation of this with 3 young women. My goodness, what state have we got to? When we abduct 3 young women, one of them an honourable member of parliament, and allow them to be taken from police cells and handed over to men who then inflict the most shocking torture on them. And it is a time for reflection for people like Nick Mangwana. He said that you can see from a long way off this choreography that he talks about. Well, my response to that, well, actually he's going to understand that people can see from across the oceans what is going on. And the international community simply will not be fooled by this propaganda. The facts are clear for all to see.
So with this gross human rights violations that are happening in Zimbabwe, in the new dispensation as they call it, do you think this is a new time for the government of Zimbabwe to come out clean and say, in terms of the commission as well, the work of the commission, the Human Rights Commission, are these commissions independent in the new dispensation?
Well, unfortunately, they're not. We spent a lot of time in the run-up to the completion of the new constitution to try and create these constitutionally established institutions which are designed to protect the Constitution and citizens' constitutional rights. Now, the best protection, of course, is found when those bodies are staffed by genuine independent people, non-partisan people who are there for their integrity and their professionalism. Now, one would think that where one has such gross human rights abuses, as we've seen this week, that commissions such as the Human Rights Commission and others, the Gender Commission, for example, would be the first to speak out and to condemn this. but their silence has been deafening.
The country is facing a lockdown, COVID-19 lockdown. The schools haven't opened so far. We haven't heard from the Minister of Primary and Secondary Education about when the schools are going to open. What measures are there set by the government to open the schools? We haven't heard from the government. As the former Minister of Primary and Secondary Education, what would you have done differently in terms of, under this lockdown, opening the schools and so on?
Well, there are many things that I would have done differently, but let me focus on a few. The most important asset in any education system is your body of teachers. It is important to keep teachers motivated, to speak to teachers, to treat them as professionals. And long before this lockdown, in the last few years, we've seen a steady deterioration in the relationship between government and teachers. Teachers' salaries have been completely annihilated. They now earn literally a pauper's wage. And they have been treated as well in an abominable fashion. If one looks at how teachers of, for example, ARTU's trade union were treated last year, abducted, tortured, subjected to spurious prosecutions, that is hardly the conduct which is going to lead to a good relationship between teachers and government. So the problem existed long before COVID-19. And that is the fundamental issue that has to be addressed. One has to restore confidence in the teacher body so that they are prepared to continue to make sacrifices. And the reason I use the word sacrifices is with particular reference to COVID-19. Because you will appreciate that many teachers will be placed in jeopardy if schools open. Teachers, perhaps particularly elderly teachers, teachers perhaps with underlying medical conditions, will have to go into classrooms with 30, 40 children who don't understand what social distancing entails and who are, medical science shows us, the carriers of diseases. Colds and flu rampage through schools. And that is why schools have been closed the world over, because there is an understanding that children, whilst they may not be susceptible to this disease themselves, will be carriers, will be asymptomatic and carriers of this disease, and place some teachers in serious jeopardy. And so to place teachers back into the classroom, one has to restore confidence. We're going to, and let me say this, that I believe that we have to get schools open as soon as possible, because there's a real danger that the longer this goes on, very important educational building blocks are going to be lost in the educational development of this current generation of children.
Are we ready to open schools at this particular point?
Sorry?
Are we ready to open schools at this particular point?
Well, I don't think that we are ready to open schools in the way they operated prior to the advent of this pandemic. But we do need to be innovative. So, for example, we need to be conducting an assessment of our teacher body. And elderly teachers need to be protected. Even younger teachers who've got underlying medical conditions must also be protected, and perhaps they should not be in the classroom. But there are many teachers in their 20s, 30s, 40s, even 50s who will not be subject to such danger. What we've seen from this virus the world over is that it tends to hit the very elderly and those with underlying medical conditions. And so we can assume that if we provide younger teachers with masks, and if we try to limit the size of classes, and even during this winter, perhaps have some classes even outdoors or in gymnasiums, if that's possible, that we should be able to protect teachers and open schools. So my what I would be doing if I was minister is I would be having these discussions with teacher bodies to work out what their concerns are, how we can address their concerns, because it is teachers, after all, who are going to be most at risk when schools open.
Earlier this year, we saw the Ncube students demonstrating and marching in the case of Bulawayo against the high tuition fees and the poor learning environment. And also we saw the increase in terms of university tuition fees. Let's talk about the right to education in Zimbabwe. Is it affordable? Is every child given the right to education in Zimbabwe?
Well, as you know, in the Constitution, there is that right to education, but it's not being honoured. In real terms, the amount of money being allocated to education has plummeted. And I've always argued that we need to change our national priorities. And fundamentally, it's a budgetary issue. We have to cut back on certain expenditure. We have to cut back on the size of Parliament. We have to cut back on cabinet privileges. We have to cut back on the size of the military and the CIO and other institutions. We have to tackle corruption so that more money comes into coffers and redirect that money towards education, health and housing for people. Those should be the government's priorities. Until we do that, education will remain badly funded. Teachers will receive a pauper's wage. Schools will not have the necessary textbooks and other facilities that they need. And our children will get a substandard education. But the only way we can afford to do that is by having the serious national debate and changing our budgetary priorities.
Speaking of our budget in Zimbabwe, let's look at the right to health now. And the money is given to the health ministry. In terms of now, we are facing COVID-19. We saw our quarantine centers are not ready for COVID-19. People are not ready to, even nurses don't have PPEs. How do you react to those things as a former minister, as someone who's sitting in the cabinet? How do you react to those things?
Well, in many ways, the health sector is very similar to the education sector in that you have a large body of professionals, and without doctors and nurses, there's no health system to speak of. You can have as many hospital buildings and drugs, but if you don't have dedicated, competent doctors and nurses to administer those drugs and treatments, you have no health system. And I come back to the issue of Peter Magambe and some of the statements made by senior government officials against doctors, likening doctors to technicians and the like. Well, that's simply unacceptable. And it is the worst possible recipe for any health system. You have to treat your doctors and nurses well. You start off by paying them properly and treating them properly. You don't abduct and torture the head of your Junior Doctors Hospital Association. So that's the starting point. And tragically for this country now, we now have to deal with this pandemic on the backdrop, with the backdrop of the soured relationship between doctors on the one hand and government on the other. We've also lost a lot of doctors. I mean, Peter Magambe, for example, is no longer in the country. He now works elsewhere. And many of our best medical professionals have left the country. So that's the start of this. But I've been profoundly shocked by the lack of government response to this pandemic. There's been a lot of talk about money being allocated. But even here in Bulawayo, if you speak to those people, both within government and in the private sector, who are working tirelessly to get these hospitals up and running, you will find that money that has been promised by government has not been forthcoming, at least at the time of this interview.
Now let's focus on the constitutional amendment in Zimbabwe, number 2 of 2019. When in 2013 this constitution was written, there was a sign of unity in Zimbabwe, and people were united in Zimbabwe. But now we are amending this constitution at this particular time when there is no unity in Zimbabwe, when people are hungry, but you are amending the constitution. Why are we amending it before aligning the laws?
Well, that's the 65,000, or perhaps in Zimbabwe currency terms, the $65 billion question. Bear in mind, we need to take our minds back to that process, which started in 2009. It was an exhaustive process, which cost a lot of money, from 2009 culminating in the referendum in 2013. It was a process which included all the people of Zimbabwe. It was not something that happened in a few weeks. There were consultations countrywide. There was a lot of political haggling, give and take. And ultimately that was subjected to a referendum in March 2013. And as we recall, 95% of those who voted, and there was an overwhelming turnout, voted in favor of that constitution. That means that there was a broad national consensus regarding the terms of that constitution. Now, if we compare that to the American Constitution, that process, the American Constitution was basically devised by a few white men sitting in a hall in Philadelphia. There was some discussion with the population in America, but nothing like the discussion that was held in Zimbabwe. The American Constitution in 200 years has, I think, been amended less than 30 times. I don't know the precise number, but it's a small number of amendments. In fact, they're so small that they talk about the Fifth Amendment. They can name them. They are so few. Here we are in Zimbabwe, a few years after we've had this broad process costing millions of dollars, arriving at this amazing national consensus, where the government suddenly wants to amend the Constitution, and virtually every single amendment drives a coach and horses through the entire policy and principles of that Constitution. One of the most important policies that was included in the 2013 Constitution was to limit the power of the executive and to spread that power, to balance that power amongst the three main organs of state, the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. And also to devolve a lot of power to the provinces. And yet these amendments now, as I say, go right against the spirit of that and seek to concentrate power once again in the hands of the executive.
In your view, why are we giving power, too much power, on the executive?
Well, I think these constitutional amendments indicate the paranoia of Mr. Mnangagwa and ZANU-PF. They are a reflection of their deep sense of insecurity at present in the run-up to the next elections. They have not delivered on any of their promises. They have not delivered housing, they've not delivered health or education, they have not tackled corruption. It's worse than ever. And so Mr. Mnangagwa knows that he's going to be even more unpopular in 2023 than he was in 2018, that it's going to be even more difficult for him to win that election. And so in preparation for that, you can see that they are amending the Constitution so that he can pretty much handpick the judges he wants. Judges he likes will not retire before 2023. They do not have to be subjected to public scrutiny before they are appointed. The public protector likewise and the prosecutor general will not be subjected to public scrutiny. And they are clearly all designed to consolidate his power. The same applies to the change in the provisions regarding the vice president. What we sought to do was to broaden the scope of the senior leadership, that people would vote for a team more than just an individual. So you would vote for a team, for a president and a vice president, and that there would be certainty what would happen in the event of a president dying or resigning, so that there would be continuity. We've seen, just in our recent experience with the coup leading to Mr. Mugabe's departure from office, that the people who voted for Mr. Mugabe in 2013 voted for Mr. Mugabe. They didn't vote for Mr. Mnangagwa. And yet, because of the deficiencies of the old constitution, it allowed Mr. Mnangagwa to take over from Mr. Mugabe in November 2017. Well, the constitution, as you know, has got this delayed clause. This provision was only going to kick in soon, that in future elections you vote for a president and a vice president. Well, now, of course, they seek to change that so that you give the power back to the party to choose a vice president in the event of the president dying, which consolidates even further power in the hands of the president, because he can pick and choose vice presidents and fire them in the course of his tenure.
Senator, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Right, we've been watching Know Your Right. My name is Brighton. This is Asake Online. I was joined by Senator David Coltart to talk more about the issue of the Constitution Amendment in Zimbabwe. Till next time, this is Asake Online. Do follow me on Twitter at @TheRulePerfector. Do follow him on Twitter at David Coltart, and do follow us on Twitter at SideZW. Till next time, #Asake.